They say that on a still night in the mountains of Colorado, you can hear voices drifting through the halls of the Stanley Hotel. Soft murmurs that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Guests have reported the sound of children laughing when no children were present. Others speak of pianos playing by unseen hands, the notes echoing faintly through the grand ballroom, even when the instrument itself sits untouched. And in some of the rooms, most notoriously room 217, guests claim to have awoken to a figure standing at the foot of their bed, silent, waiting, and gone in an instant. The Stanley Hotel, perched just above the town of Estes Park, looks serene by day. Its white wooden facade gleams against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, and its manicured grounds give the impression of wealth, beauty, and elegance. Yet behind this genteel exterior lies a history steeped in unease. Mysteries that reach back to its construction in the early 1900s, and tales of spirits that refuse to leave its walls. Perhaps the most famous of all accounts came from Stephen King himself. In the autumn of 1974, King and his wife, Tabitha, checked into the hotel as its only guests, just before it closed for the winter. Wandering through its cavernous, empty corridors, King reportedly felt a strange, unsettling energy. That night, he dreamt of his son running through the hotel's long hallways, chased by a fire hose that had come alive. He woke in a cold sweat, walked out onto the balcony to smoke a cigarette, and by the time he returned to bed, the seed for The Shining had been planted. But the haunting of the Stanley Hotel goes far beyond the inspiration for a novel. For decades, countless guests and staff members have spoken of experiences that defy explanation. Lights flicker when no one touches the switches. Luggage has been seen moving across rooms on its own. Doors slam shut when the air is still. The hotel's grand staircase, the very one that Stephen King himself descended during his stay, is said to be a hotspot for paranormal activity, with shadowy figures appearing in photographs and cold spots chilling the air. Among the hotel's most enduring legends is the story of Elizabeth Wilson, the head housekeeper in the early years of the hotel. In 1911, she was injured in a gas explosion that tore through room 217, nearly killing her. Though she survived, her spirit is said to linger. Guests in that room often report waking to find their belongings neatly unpacked or their clothes mysteriously folded. Some have even described seeing a woman in Victorian-era attire, quietly moving about the room before vanishing into thin air. Yet the question remains, what anchors these spirits to the Stanley Hotel? Is it the trauma of sudden death, like Wilson's near-fatal accident? Is it the emotional energy of thousands of guests who have passed through its doors? Or is it something darker, something tied not to the people but to the land itself? The story of the Stanley Hotel begins long before Stephen King and long before Elizabeth Wilson's accident. To truly understand why this hotel became one of the most haunted places in America, we must return to its very foundations and to the man whose name it still bears. Before we uncover more, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more chilling history. Freeland Oscar Stanley was a man of ambition, a dreamer who sought to build something extraordinary in the wilderness of Colorado. But what drove him to create this grand hotel in the shadow of the Rockies was not only wealth and vision, it was also a brush with death itself. For Stanley, the mountains were not simply a place of beauty, they were a place of salvation. And yet, as the story goes, places of salvation often carry shadows of their own. Freeland Oscar Stanley was not born into the kind of fortune that builds castles in the mountains. Born in 1849 in rural Maine, Stanley was a tinkerer, an inventor with a restless spirit. With his twin brother, Francis, he developed a fascination for photography and eventually steam-powered technology. Together, the brothers founded the Stanley Motor Carriage Company, creators of the famous Stanley Steamer, an automobile that revolutionized travel at the turn of the 20th century. By the time Freeland reached middle age, his fortune was secure, but his health was not. In 1903, doctors diagnosed him with tuberculosis, a disease that in those days was often a death sentence. Weakened and coughing blood, Stanley was told he had but a few months to live. His doctor recommended a radical treatment, fresh mountain air. And so, Stanley and his wife Flora journeyed westward, settling in Estes Park, Colorado. What followed seemed little short of miraculous. Surrounded by the crisp alpine air and rugged mountain beauty, Stanley's health improved dramatically. Within a season, he regained weight, strength, and the will to live. The mountains, it seemed, had saved him. But Stanley was not content merely to survive. He wanted to leave a legacy. Looking upon Estes Park, a small, rustic town with few accommodations, he envisioned a grand hotel, one that would bring luxury and refinement to the rugged frontier. Construction began in 1907, and by 1909, the Stanley Hotel opened its doors. Its gleaming white facade, red roof, and panoramic views of the Rockies made it a destination unlike any other. Guests were ferried to the grounds in Stanley's own steam-powered vehicles, and within its walls, they found electricity, running water, and even telephones, luxuries rare in that remote corner of Colorado. By day, it was a place of laughter, music, and elegance. Flora Stanley, a gifted pianist, often played in the grand ballroom, filling the air with music that floated into the mountain night. Yet even in its earliest years, whispers of the uncanny began to circulate. Some claimed to see fleeting figures in the hallways, shadows where none should be. Guests spoke of an odd heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched when alone in their rooms. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as tricks of the imagination, fueled by the isolation of the Rockies and the eerie silence that surrounded the hotel at night. But others believed something lingered there, something woven into the very bones of the building. Perhaps it was the land itself, steeped in centuries of Native American history. Some tribes had considered the valley sacred, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. To build upon it, they said, was to disturb the spirits. As the years passed, the hotel thrived, drawing wealthy visitors from across the country. Yet its reputation as a place touched by the supernatural grew as well. Staff members told stories in hushed tones, doors opening on their own, lights flickering without cause, footsteps echoing in empty corridors. The grand staircase, often called the vortex, became infamous for strange phenomena. Photographs taken there frequently revealed misty shapes, orbs of light, and even faint outlines of human forms that had not been present when the shutter clicked. One of the earliest recorded ghostly encounters came from Flora Stanley herself. Though she lived into her 90s, guests and staff later swore they could still hear her music long after she had passed away. The grand ballroom, with its polished floors and glittering chandeliers, remains one of the hotel's most haunted spaces. Visitors often report hearing the soft strains of piano music when the room is empty, and some even claim to see the faint outline of a woman seated at the keys, her back straight, her hands gliding across invisible notes. And then there was room 217. Long before Stephen King checked into it, the room had already gained notoriety. The explosion in 1911, which nearly killed housekeeper Elizabeth Wilson, left behind more than physical scars. Guests staying in 217 describe lights turning on and off, their belongings rearranged, and an overwhelming sense of presence. Many report dreams so vivid they wake, gasping for breath, convinced someone else is in the room. Some even say the door itself locks and unlocks without a key, as though the room has a will of its own. But if the stories of the ballroom and room 217 were unsettling, other accounts from the Stanley Hotel crossed into something darker. Guests and staff began to speak of figures appearing in the basement, whispers rising from the empty concert hall, and even sightings of ghostly children playing in the hallways at night. What binds them all is a question that has haunted the Stanley for over a century. Why do the dead linger here? Are they drawn by unfinished business? Or is the hotel itself a beacon, a gathering place for restless spirits? By the mid-20th century, the Stanley Hotel had entered a period of decline. Tourism waned, the building aged, and whispers of hauntings became louder than the music of the ballroom. And then, in 1974, Stephen King walked through its doors and gave the hotel a second life, not just as a luxury resort, but as one of the most famous haunted locations in the world. But before we revisit King's terrifying night in room 217, there is another layer to explore, a collection of eyewitness encounters that span decades, and which suggests that the Stanley's ghosts are more than mere legend. For in the Stanley Hotel, it is not only the guests who tell ghost stories, it is the building itself. By the 1960s and 70s, the Stanley Hotel was no longer the glittering jewel of the Rockies. Its once pristine walls had begun to fade, the paint peeling and the wood creaking with age. The wealthy elites who once flocked to Estes Park sought newer, more modern retreats, leaving the Stanley to weather seasons of decline. And yet, during this period, its reputation as a haunted place grew stronger than ever. Former employees recalled strange events during the hotel's quieter years. Maids spoke of entering rooms that should have been empty, only to find indentations on freshly made beds, as if someone had just lain there. Maintenance workers told of tools vanishing and reappearing days later in entirely different locations. Guests complained of hearing children running through the hallways late at night, though when staff investigated, no families with children were checked in. The basement, cold and dark even in summer, became infamous among workers. Shadows seemed to move there, independent of any light source, and some described hearing low voices echoing through the stone walls. A few swore they saw figures darting just out of sight, their footsteps quick and soft, as though running to hide. But among all the tales, none gained more notoriety than those surrounding room 217. Guests checking in often did so with trepidation, for by then, the story of Elizabeth Wilson, the housekeeper nearly killed in the explosion, had become local legend. Some guests awoke to find their bags unpacked or their shoes neatly aligned at the foot of the bed, as though someone had quietly tidied their belongings during the night. Couples reported an icy tension in the room, with arguments erupting over trivial matters, only for the hostility to vanish once they left. Many believed Elizabeth's ghost lingered, keeping order in the space she once tended, ensuring everything was in its place. It was into this atmosphere that Stephen King and his wife checked in on a fateful October night in 1974. The hotel was preparing to close for the winter, leaving the couple nearly alone in its cavernous halls. As King wandered through the empty ballroom, he imagined parties long past, the laughter and music lingering like echoes on the air. Later, in a dream, he saw his young son running terrified through the endless corridors, pursued by a living fire hose that twisted and lunged like a serpent. He awoke drenched in fear, stepped onto the balcony for air, and by the time he returned to his bed, the idea for The Shining had taken hold. Though King's novel was fiction, his experience tapped into something deeply real about the Stanley Hotel. Guests who followed after spoke of similar sensations, overwhelming dread, vivid nightmares, and an uncanny feeling that the hotel itself was alive, its hallways stretching endlessly in the mind like a labyrinth. Over the years, reports multiplied. Some guests claimed to see apparitions of former staff, dressed in early 20th century uniforms, silently moving through the corridors. Others described a little boy calling out for his nanny, his voice echoing faintly before fading into silence. Paranormal investigators who visited the hotel recorded unexplained cold spots, flickering lights, and voices captured on audio. Whispers too faint to hear at the time, but unmistakable upon playback. The grand staircase, known by many as the Vortex, remained a hotspot of activity. Photographs taken by tourists revealed shapes hovering on the stairs, faces peering out from the banisters, and mists forming human-like outlines. In one particularly famous image, two distinct figures appear at the top of the staircase. One a woman in period dress, the other a child, though neither was present when the picture was taken. Skeptics argue that the stories are fueled by suggestion, that the Stanley S fame as the shining ES inspiration primes visitors to imagine things in the dark. But those who have stayed within its walls tell a different story, of voices too clear to be dismissed, of shadows too deliberate to be coincidence. And perhaps most chilling of all are the reports of what lingers not in the guest rooms or the ballroom, but in the very heart of the hotel, the concert hall. There, in the silence of the night, staff and guests alike have encountered something that cannot be so easily explained. The concert hall of the Stanley Hotel was meant to be a place of joy, laughter, and music. Built as a gift for Flora Stanley, who loved the piano, it became the social heart of the hotel during its golden years. By day it rang with elegant notes and lively chatter. But by night, long after the guests retired, the hall became something else entirely, a chamber of echoes, where the past refused to stay silent. Staff members closing up late at night have reported hearing footsteps on the stage, the creak of wooden boards bending beneath invisible weight. Lights flicker on and off without explanation, and in the stillness, faint whispers rise, as if conversations from another century are still unfolding. Many speak of Flora herself, her presence lingering in the hall, seated at the piano she once loved. Guests have heard music drift through the darkness, only to find the piano untouched, its keys resting silently beneath the dust. But Flora is not the only spirit said to haunt the concert hall. For decades, reports have surfaced of a young boy named Billy. Some say he was the child of a worker. Others believe he was a guest who fell ill at the hotel and never left. His laughter, light and fleeting, is often heard near the backstage area. Paranormal investigators who set up equipment there have captured recordings of a child's voice answering direct questions. Sometimes he giggles, other times he responds with a single word: play. Those who encounter him describe a playful energy, but also a sense of deep loneliness, as though the boy is forever waiting for someone who never returned. Other spirits are less benign. Guests touring the basement level of the concert hall describe feelings of dread, as if dozens of unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. Some have reported being touched, a cold hand brushing against their arms, or their clothing tugged when no one was near. On rare occasions, visitors claim to see a dark shape moving along the walls, humanoid but indistinct, its form shifting with every blink. It never lingers long enough to be truly seen, but its presence leaves the air heavy and suffocating. The hotel's long hallways and grand staircase continue to attract paranormal seekers, many of whom leave with chilling photographic evidence. Faces in windows, glowing orbs, or shapes that resemble former staff. Room 401, once a servant's quarters, has its own reputation. Male guests often report an unseen force tugging at their covers, or a voice whispering just behind their ear. Some awaken in the night to find a shadowy figure looming by the closet, only for it to vanish when the lights are switched on. And then there is room 428, where guests tell of hearing heavy footsteps on the roof above and voices murmuring in a language they cannot understand. On occasion, visitors have even reported the apparition of a cowboy sitting casually in a chair, tipping his hat before disappearing into thin air. For skeptics, the Stanley Hotel remains a grand old building with creaky floors, drafts, and the power of suggestion amplified by its famous connection to The Shining. But for believers, and for those who have felt its icy breath in the dark, there is no doubt that the Stanley is alive with something more than memory. Today, the hotel leans into its reputation, offering ghost tours that draw visitors from around the world. Guests come in search of history, of Stephen King's inspiration, and of the chance to glimpse a shadow that doesn't belong. Some leave with nothing more than a story. Others leave with something they can't explain. Photographs that show more than they intended, recordings with voices no one heard in the moment, and memories that haunt their dreams for years to come. The Stanley Hotel remains perched above Estes Park, its white facade gleaming in the sun by day, its windows glowing faintly by night. Some call it America's most haunted hotel. Others call it a place of inspiration. But to those who have walked its hallways alone, who have felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them, one truth lingers. At the Stanley Hotel, not every guest who checks in ever truly leaves.